where does money come from? Most people think that money is created by the government. We've all seen these pictures of the printing presses, and this is the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, which is in fact a government agency. But the Bureau of Engraving and Printing is just the printer. The customer is the Federal Reserve, and they put in the order for the bills, and they get them for 6 cents, or roughly 6 cents a bill, no matter what the face amount is. So if it's a $100 bill, they get it for 6 cents. And they do not, they do not, contrary to these pictures you see of the helicopter flying, helicopter Ben dropping dollars on the economy, they do not give them away. They don't give them to us, and they don't give them to the government. They lend them. So even the dollars that come into existence from the Federal Reserve are lent into the economy. They're lent to other banks, which then lend them to individuals and corporations and the government, all at interest. It's not just the Federal Reserve, but all banks that create money in this way with accounting entries. There are many authorities that have said this, but one that I liked particularly well because he encapsulated it well was Robert B. Anderson, who was Treasury Secretary under Eisenhower, and he said, when a bank makes a loan, it simply adds to the borrower's deposit account in the bank by the amount of the loan. The money is not taken from anyone else's deposit. It was not previously paid into the bank by anyone. It's new money created by the bank for the use of the borrower. So this is the textbook model of how money comes into existence. It's not totally accurate, but that's like banking 201. This is banking 101. You start with your $100 deposit. You're supposed to hold back 10% if there's a 10% reserve requirement. So then you're allowed to make a $90 loan, and then that $90 will become a deposit in the borrower's account, which becomes a check, which goes into another bank. Now so that bank now has $90. It holds back $9 and writes an $81 check, which goes into the next bank, and it holds back 10%. So $100 becomes $1,000, or $10,000 in this chart from the Federal Reserve Modern Money Mechanics. $10,000 becomes $100,000. But what's interesting about this chart is that you can see that the $10,000 is still there. It never left the bank. So you never go to the bank and they say, I'm sorry, we just lent your money out to Mr. Smith. Come back in 30 years when the loan is paid off. You can always get your money because they have basically double counted the deposits, and that's how money is created. It all goes back to the goldsmiths of the 17th century. Well, in England, actually it goes back to the Italian bankers of about, it goes back a millennium with the Italian bankers, but in the British system, the English system, the goldsmiths were readmitted to England in the 17th century, and they would keep people's gold for safekeeping, and they would issue these little paper receipts that became banknotes. And everybody liked the banknotes better than the gold. I mean, they didn't want to carry around this heavy gold because it was heavy and you could steal it. So some people wanted to borrow the gold, but they too preferred the little paper receipts. So the goldsmiths early on discovered that they could lend as much as 10 times as many notes as they had gold, and nobody would notice. And so they charged interest, of course, on that. So they were multiplying their profits in this way. Although even today, I mean, all through the system, that's the way it's been. But bankers themselves will tell you they don't create money. I mean, it's so weird what they're doing. All they were doing was just making loans when people asked for it. You know, from their point of view, they were just making a little profit here as best they could. But in fact, you can see that they were creating money. So today, virtually all of our money is created by banks. What the government creates is coins, which is $1 billion worth roughly, which is about 1/10,000th of the money supply or less. So on this chart, the bottom blue is M1, that's coins, dollar bills, and checkbook money. So coins, even if you count dollar bills as being issued by the government, which obviously is questionable, that money is only about halfway up the little blue mark. And then all of the rest, where does that come from? It comes from bank-created credit. This chart only goes up to 2006 because that's when the Fed quit reporting M3, which is that yellow block at the top. They quit reporting it because they didn't really know where to cut it off. Once they got into derivatives, it's like money and near money. You can see M2 is close substitutes. Well, derivatives are now over $2 quadrillion, something like $1.5 quadrillion. So the chart would, it would be too obvious what's going on if they put that in the chart. So now they stop at M2. But anyway, you can see that most, if not all, of the money, except for the coins, is created by banks. The problem with the system, money reformers will argue about this, but I'm going to say the problem with the system is the interest. Because the banks always want more money back than they put out there. And so they don't create that money. I mean, they create the principal, they don't create the interest. Where's the interest to come from? Somebody somewhere has to take out another loan to create that interest. And so what you wind up with is a pyramid scheme like this, or Ponzi scheme. So over the last 300 years, debt has gone around the world, and we managed to trap the third world into debt. And then when that source was exhausted, when the parasites' food source globally was exhausted, they came back to the homeowners, and then when they went through their homeowners, now they're onto the students. So essentially they've run out of, the parasite has run out of its food source and it's about to collapse. So what is the alternative? We actually had a sustainable system. This is the original American system developed by the colonists sort of by accident because they didn't have gold and silver. And so it started in 1691, which was 3 years before the Bank of England was founded. The governor of Massachusetts was fighting a little local war, and he was trying to pay his soldiers, and he couldn't find anybody to borrow the money from. So he got this idea that he would just issue these little receipts and say, these are little receipts acknowledging that you have delivered service to the colony, and then you can go out and spend those receipts and the colony acknowledges that you've done service for them, and so you're entitled to spend the receipts on goods and services. And then those little notes circulated in the community. And that system, well, some colonies, it was more sustainable than others. The northern colonies tended to just print, and it did become inflationary eventually. It inflated the rate, made the prices go up. But in some of the colonies, the most sustainable of the systems was the colony of Pennsylvania. It was a Quaker colony. The Quakers, like the Jews, were a discriminated against sect in England, and they couldn't go into other forms of business, and so they went into banking. But the Quaker model was a community model where it was a public bank, and the profits went back to the public, went back to the government. So Benjamin Franklin wrote about this system and popularized it, so he was called the father of paper money. But he didn't really devise it, he just wrote about it. The system was sustainable in the sense that the government could print the interest as well as so the government did create the interest along with the principal. So let's say the government created $105, they could lend $100, then they could spend the $5 on government budget. And so you would have $105 out there. It would all come back as principal and interest. They could lend the same $100, spend the same $5, and they could do that over and over, and they wouldn't have to expand the money supply. So during that period, there were no taxes except for excise taxes on liquor. The prices did not inflate, and there was no government debt. That worked very well, but probably too well, and King George said the colonies could no longer issue new issues of money. They were getting complaints from the merchants, and when the Bank of England, well, it was actually Benjamin Franklin, he spoke a little too highly of the system. He went to England to defend it and said, this is working out really well for us, that this is the reason that the colonies are so abundant and things are going so well. And the Bank of England people said, that was not the point of a colony. The colony was there to serve the mother country. And so they cut off this source and made them pay their taxes in gold. And of course we didn't have gold, so we had to borrow from the British bankers who issued these little paper receipts, supposedly backed by gold. And so that put us in debt to the British bankers, and it contracted the money supply. There was a big depression, and the colonists rebelled, issued money anyway, and that was considered an act of rebellion, so that prompted the American Revolution, so it is said by some sources. So we won the war, but we lost the power to create our own money. We wound up with big war debts, and Congress was, well, it's a long story how the Bank of the British came in and counterfeited the script. So they actually printed more of this paper script than the colonists did, and it did hyperinflate and lost its value. And the founding fathers were then so afraid of the paper money that they just left it out of the Constitution. They had to come up with something rather quickly. There were like riots outside this little room where they were putting this all together. So, and they couldn't agree on whether to allow the Congress the power to issue paper money. So they just left it out. They didn't say who could do it. They said Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof, and that was it. And we've been arguing about that. I mean, there have been lawsuits, legal opinions about it for 200 years about what exactly that meant. So Alexander Hamilton was faced with these big debts, like particularly the French wanted to get paid in gold. They weren't going to take this paper script anyway. And so he did set up a bank like the Bank of England, which was authorized to lend money to the government backed by their gold. So the government, what gold the government had was put in this first U.S. bank, and then they issued a lot of paper receipts, supposedly backed by gold. But this allowed them to expand the money supply to many multiples of what they really had. They paid off the French, they paid off all their debts, and got the economy going, and it worked really well. The problem was that it started this spiral of debt that we're still in. I mean, a system where we have to borrow from private banks instead of issuing the money that we could be issuing ourselves, as the colonists did. So Lincoln actually went back to that system during the Civil War when, again, he was faced with huge war debts. Usurious interest rates were being charged by the Bank of England. So he was advised by one of his advisors that he could just issue money. The colonists had done it. He could do it himself. He had the power to issue U.S. notes or greenbacks, which he did, and won the war, and also did a lot of development during those 4 years. And it was an amazingly productive period where they did put the railroad all the way across the country and so forth. But of course he was assassinated, and that program was discontinued. So today we are back to banker-issued money. And one problem with it is you would have these waves of defaults and depressions and money contractions. The bankers would call in the loans and people's real estate would go into default, and then the bankers would get the real estate. So and it would cause bank panics. There'd be runs in the banks because there wasn't enough gold in the banks. And so after a particularly bad bank run in 1907, the Federal Reserve was set up to backstop these bank runs. So basically what it was this great big shell game. And because the peas weren't under the shells and people kept figuring that out, the Federal Reserve was devised to invent peas as necessary and to put them under whichever shells needed them. So it was a large fraud that was backstopped by a sort of over-fraud that